Good morning. It's Sunday, January 27th. I'm going to record an update just to answer some questions that people asked over the past week. Last Sunday, we had a snow emergency level 3 in the county where our church meets. So church was canceled. But in addition to that, about a week ago, Tuesday evening, early Wednesday morning, I came down with the worst pain in my life. Ended up Wednesday in the hospital with extremely severe pancreatitis. Had a bunch of tests. Had to be without any food or water for 72 hours. I did have some gallbladder issues as well. And so on Saturday, a little bit before noon, a week ago Saturday, on the 19th, they took out my gallbladder. I came home Sunday afternoon. I've taken the week off. So the reason why there was no update last week was because church was canceled and I was also in the hospital. So thank you for your prayers, your concerns, and everything. I'm feeling much better. I've lost almost 30 pounds in 2 weeks. It's not the weight loss program that I would recommend to anyone, but I do feel much better and greatly appreciate your cards, letters, communications, prayers, whatever. And also a special shout out to my wife, who's been an excellent nurse. And she does, by the way, she refers to herself as Nurse Ratchet in making sure that I keep on the straight and narrow path. So great medical care at Riverside Methodist Hospital. So let's do an update. I've titled it "Crazy, No Strike That Evil World." You may have seen the lawyer shows and that type of thing, and the lawyer always says "strike that." Just so you know, a little inside secret: when you say "strike that," the only thing that happens is the transcript will say "strike that." They never strike anything. I was taking a deposition of a lady once, and I had said strike something. Then she thought she could do it, and she was sort of talking to the court reporter, and of course the court reporter was on her stenography machine and kept typing, and she said, no, stop typing that. And of course the transcript said, stop typing that. And she kept saying, no, wipe that out, erase that, I want to start over. And that's all the transcript says. So it doesn't really work, but look, it is a crazy world. It's an evil world. I don't think, from talking to a number of people and the communications I've had this week, that there's been a week where it's been more apparent than this past week. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about some of the, I think, prophetically significant events that have occurred over the past week. What we always talk about, the convergence of events. Let me start off first, though, with just a few Bible verses to put everything in context. Then we'll talk a little bit about church, a little bit about politics, culture in the United States, deception, bad thinking. All of these things are prophetically relevant. So in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, and I know that these particular passages are associated with the rise of the Antichrist. The Antichrist will come on the scene, and he will rise to power, and he will begin ruling at the midpoint of the 70th week. But the apostasy and falling away from the faith and that type of thing that leads to his rise will be well in place before he comes on the scene. And I think that we see that right now in our world. I don't think there's any question that this is what's happening. So verse 7, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 7 says this: "For the mystery of iniquity doth already work. Only he who now letteth will let, until he be taken out of the way." Then in verse 11, "And for this cause God shall send them strong delusion, that they should believe a lie, that they all might be damned, who believed not the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness." Similarly, over in Romans chapter 1, the passage really starts at verse 18 and discusses the fact that people engage in these unnatural, immoral acts. And as a result of that, God sends judgment on them. In verse 22, it says, professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. Verse 28, and even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind to do those things which are not convenient. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 18, it says, for the preaching of the cross is to them that perish foolishness, but unto us which are saved it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and I will bring to nothing the understanding of the prudent. And essentially what those verses say is that this delusion, this inability to reason that results in really, at times, unspeakable evil, is a result, it's a judgment of God on man who is rejecting the apparent simple truth of the Word of God, that is rejecting the simplicity and beauty of the gospel. And eventually God just gives them up. In fact, you could, if you take the root words there in 1 Corinthians, the root word that's discussed about foolishness is moroni. And so it essentially means that God, for lack of a better term, God morons the world. And I think we've seen a lot of that today. This is an article by Mancal Mueller. He's a relatively well-known radio disc jockey. He professes to be a Christian. He was part of Harvest Bible Chapel up in that's based out of Illinois. James McDonald is the lead pastor. You may have heard his radio program, Walk with the Word. McDonald has been put on a sabbatical. This has been a long-going thing. This stretches back a decade. McDonald and Harvest recently sued some people who were critical of Harvest, and then when they were pressed to produce documents and emails and that sort of thing, they dismissed the lawsuit. McDonald was put on a sabbatical. It was then announced that he was going to go down to one of the satellite campuses of Harvest in Naples, Florida, and he would be teaching down there. It was very interesting. You can find this up. The pastor, I believe his last name is Sechrist, down there was asked if James could come down and serve his sabbatical at the church, and he agreed. But then all of these allegations of wrongdoings and stuff really started to come out. And so Pastor Sechrist at the Harvest Naples campus asked that James McDonald not come, and he wrote to his congregation, said he didn't understand this. He then said that the church there wanted to withdraw from the Harvest Fellowship and become an independent church. The result was that the Harvest board, whoever is in charge, fired him. It's a very ugly thing, and Mancal, the DJ, writes in this article he was very close to McDonald, spent a lot of time with him, was over at his house, and was very concerned about essentially he's changed his opinion completely, and is very distressed that the elders at Harvest allowed this to go on. I could give you the examples of some of the misconduct, the bullying that's gone on. Mancal relates the fact that someone came over to his house and essentially demanded that he give $3 million to Harvest. He said, well, I'm currently unemployed. Then they said, well, then sell your memorabilia and you can give that money then to the church. And he essentially felt that he was being strong-armed to give money to the church. He said eventually he's just, as he said in the article, he's pulled his head out of the sand and he understands that this is a problem. Julie Roys, Julie Roys, R-O-Y-S, julieroys.com or .org. She's a reporter. She used to work with Moody, and there's some tie-ins to Moody Bible Institute in this. unfortunately, that she's written and blogged on this and has done just a fantastic job writing. So you might look up her blog and her articles for more information on this. Well, the other day, Roger Stone, one of the associates of the president, was arrested on an indictment. Now, surprisingly, having handled a couple high-profile criminal matters in which the FBI was investigating. In fact, it was the FBI under the direction of Robert Mueller that was investigating my clients. I'm familiar with what happens in these situations. So what happens is that the grand jury will issue an indictment. The indictment will be filed with the court under seal. The reason they do that, particularly in cases where there are multiple defendants, they don't want to serve the indictment on one person and have that person call up the other person and the other person flee the jurisdiction and get away. They usually will serve these very early in the morning. They'll conduct simultaneous raids. Sometimes, in one of the cases I was involved with, people were scattered literally all over the country. And so there were simultaneous FBI raids depending on where they were. On the East Coast, they started at 6 a.m. And they'll arrest them. Then the indictment will be unsealed, and the people will be arraigned. I will say this: with the charges of the type that Roger Stone is charged with, these are what I call process crimes. These are crimes that did not exist when Robert Mueller was appointed as special counsel. These are all crimes that have resulted from Stone's failure to cooperate in the investigation or lying in the investigation, but do have nothing really, as far as I can see, with the campaign itself. Now they may file what's called a superseding indictment. But I will say that it's very distressing to see, by reports are that there were 17 vehicles and 29 officers dressed in SWAT-type gear that came and arrested Roger Stone at 6 a.m. at his home in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. The reason this is done, a lot of times too, particularly in cases involving multiple parties, multiple witnesses, is this is done to send a message. This is a message that you better cooperate with the special counsel, you better give us the testimony that we want, or we'll be coming after you and arresting you in a similar fashion. And it's very disconcerting to the people. The FBI shows up pounding on the door at 6 a.m., lights are flashing and all this stuff. Now, the interesting thing about this is I am not aware of any other case in which the FBI will call a major news organization and have them there waiting when they get there. Now, I suppose it's theoretically possible that CNN just happened to think, hey, we ought to go over to Roger Stone's house this morning and see if anything is happening. It's a slow news day. I seriously doubt that happened. So just pay attention to this. This is a investigation that has taken on a life of its own. I think it's to say that I think it's distressing and even un-American is an understatement. There was a recent poll that came out, was reported in the New York Times the other day, that young voters, even Republicans, are drifting to the left on social issues. And I think this indicates a major problem that we have in the church, in culture, is that young people, are being indoctrinated. They're put in schools. Schools are not the same that they were when I was young and in school. There is a tremendous amount of indoctrination that goes on. Look at some of the results of this polling. The title of the poll from Pew Research, Generation Z, looks a lot like millennials on key social and political issues. And what you see is that there's a tremendous divide on certain issues. So, for example, here's one of the poll questions. Most generations are indifferent. This is the summary findings from the research. Most generations are indifferent about cohabitation but have a more negative view of single motherhood. And the percentage saying that couples living together without being married is blank for our society. So those who say it's a good thing, Generation Z, 20%. Doesn't make a difference, 67%. Bad thing, 12%. So you see how that goes down. So the generations, as you go down the scale on the left, get older. So you have Generation Z, Millennial, Gen X, Boomer, and Silent. So you see that Gen Z and the Millennials are about 20% think cohabitation before marriage, without being married, is a good thing for society, 20%. You get down to the Boomers and Silent generation, it's 8% and 5%, so less than half of those people. The interesting thing, though, is when you look at it, doesn't really make a difference. Across the board in our culture now, among all generations, this is not viewed negatively. The next question would be the percentage saying gay and lesbian couples being allowed to marry is a good thing or doesn't make a difference or bad thing for our society. And you can see the numbers there. Even among the Silent generation and Boomers, roughly a fourth of that generation say it's a good thing. 38-40% say that it's a 38-40% say that it's a that it doesn't make a difference. But you see here in Generation Z and the Millennials, about half of those say not that it doesn't make a difference, just that it's a good thing. So this is a huge shift. It shows that I think it shows the direction of our culture. I think it's past a tipping point. I don't think it goes back at this point, absent a massive God-blessed, God-ordained revival. I just don't see it happening. But see, if you look at the passages that are associated with the birth pangs and the end times and the rise of the Antichrist, all of these relate to delusion and people falling away from the faith and that sort of thing, and deception. So we know this is going to happen, and so it can be very distressing, though. One of the other issues, or many issues discussed in this Pew Research poll, one of the others was the percentage saying that when a form or online profile asks about a person's gender, it should include options other than man and woman. 60% of Generation Z say it should. Millennials, 50%, and of course it goes down the older that you get. And of course it goes down the older that you get. So this is a trend in our society and culture. It lines up perfectly with what the Bible says the world will be like as the time of Christ's return approaches. So every week I could, in the examples I could cite to you that prove this are legion every week. I just try to pick out some of the highlights. Well, the thing with the Covington Catholic boys who were there for the pro-life rally, it's always interesting when you watch the media discuss this. The Catholic boys who were there for the anti-abortion rally or such and such a rally. I think you've all probably seen what happened. Just to summarize quickly, they were waiting after the pro-life rally was over, at which, from what I saw, appeared to be hundreds of thousands of people attending, even though some of the media would put in their articles that over 1,000 people attended. There were hundreds of thousands of people at the pro-life rally to protest and bring to light the anniversary on January 22nd of the decision of Roe versus Wade in January 22nd, 1973. So at this rally, the boys were waiting for their bus. There was a group called Black Hebrew Israelites who were shouting some pretty vile things. You can see the video. The boys decided that they would The boys decided that in response to that they would do some school cheers, and then this American Indian tribal leader, he says, came up pounding a drum and stood here next to this young man who stood there smiling. This led to a firestorm of responses about white privilege, racism, bigotry, and that sort of thing. Everybody blaming this young man, this 16-year-old kid who stood there, didn't really do anything. He was approached by this person. And so people so here's an example. Here's Beth Moore tweeting about it. She says this: "To glee in dehumanizing any person is so utterly antichrist, it reeks of the vomit of hell." And somebody said, "What are you, anything in particular referring to?" And she said, "Across the board. Doesn't matter who's doing it, when or what side they're on. It's just wrong, and it's disturbingly frequent." And then she followed it up with yet another information or response in her Twitter account. "I cannot shake the terror of adolescence already indoctrinated." And she's referring to this young man who stood there and smiled at this person who was beating a drum in his face, never acted violently, never acted aggressively, didn't block his way. And so here's Beth Moore. This is what happens when leftism permeates people's minds. It takes away their ability to reason. So she says this, and I quote, this is from her Twitter account: "I cannot shake the terror of adolescence already indoctrinated enough in hate and disrespect to smile that chillingly and jeer without shame or fear of God. Uncurbed, this utter glee and dehumanizing is what humanitarian horrors are made of." Now, it is clear, abundantly clear by now, that her conclusion is demonstrably wrong. It's not based on fact. Her conclusion was based on some messed up politics that she has now, that she's let infect her mind and overwhelm her ability to reason and analyze facts. And there has been, I checked her Twitter account, there has been no apology, no backing off this statement. I think this is horrific. I think she should apologize. And I think you should, if you're using Beth Moore Bible Studies, there's been plenty of reasons to maybe not be doing that. I think this now ought to give you the reason not to do this. Someone pointed out that in George Orwell's book, 1984, there was a passage. Here is a passage from chapter 5 of 1984. It says this. It talks about thought crime. "His earlier thought returned to him. Probably she was not actually a member of the thought police, but then it was precisely the amateur spy who was the greatest danger of all. He did not know how long she had been looking at him, but perhaps for as much as 5 minutes. And it was possible that his features had not been perfectly under control. It was terribly dangerous to let your thoughts wander when you were in public. It was terribly dangerous to let your thoughts wander when you were in any public place or within range of a telescreen. The smallest thing could give you away. A nervous tic, an unconscious look of anxiety, a habit of muttering to yourself, anything that carried with it the suggestion of abnormality, of having something to hide. In any case, to wear an improper expression on your face, to look incredulous when a victory was announced, for example, was itself a punishable offense in the society of George Orwell's book, 1984. There was even a word for it in Newspeak. Face crime, it was called. I think there certainly are aspects to the book 1984 that are, unfortunately, are increasingly prophetic. Now, let me go on to something related to this. Notre Dame, this article, this is from the South Bend Tribune the other day. Notre Dame to cover murals of Christopher Columbus in the main building on the Notre Dame campus. There are 12 Columbus murals. They've been hanging in the hallway there of the main building on Notre Dame's campus in South Bend for 135 years. People have complained, of course, Columbus is now white privilege, politically incorrect, he was horrible, he was oppressive, he was colonialist. And so the president of Notre Dame took the step of writing a letter to campus regarding the Columbus murals. And he said, and this is from the article, the paintings offer, quote, a highly problematic vision of Western triumphalism, Catholic militarism, and an overly romantic notion of American expansion. So that what they're doing is they're not removing them, they're covering them up, they're going to take pictures of them and put them in a display where they can be considered in their proper context. The Pope is going to Morocco and release this week his logo, Servant of Hope, Morocco 2019. Now, the logo itself is quite shocking in the way that it's constructed. It is a capitulation to Islam. You see that there appears to be a cross within a crescent. It's clearly, I don't know who designed this. I don't know if they were thinking of. There's an excellent article at the Federalist that talks about why does Pope Francis' new Morocco logo imply submission to Islam. And it does. If you look at it, now this is the 800th anniversary of St. Francis of Assisi's visit to Morocco, to the Islamic Republic, to the Sultan that was in charge of that area of the Muslim world at the time in North Africa. So Francis, in his twisted leftist view of things, is trying to change what St. Francis of Assisi did 800 years ago and use it for his own political purposes, which is, I think, no question that this is to meld the religions together. So we have this. This is a long-standing problem in the Catholic Church. This is from the Assisi Conference global prayer program that Pope John Paul II had in 1986, where he brought together a number of Christian leaders, but you also see that he brought the Dalai Lama, Buddhist, animist, all sorts of different religions came, and they had this ecumenical day of prayer at Assisi in Italy, which is where St. Francis served. Subsequent to that, a couple years later, someone came and presented Pope John Paul II with a Quran, and here's a picture of him that you can still find on the internet, that he was kissing, and it's clear he was kissing the Quran. This is the Pope kissing the Quran. There was a subsequent conference at Assisi where they brought everybody together again, the Buddhists, the animists, and that sort of thing. And they had this big meeting at the chapel, or this big hall that they've built there in Assisi. And it's always been kind of interesting to me the way that all of these people are pretty much dressed in black and dark colors, and everything sort of has this focal point of the Pope in white. I personally think this is one of those indicators of the end times, that there's this ecumenism behind this spirit of Antichrist, and we've seen it forming. This is from, I think, 2002, so this has been going on for some time, but we're going to see it surface more and more. I think the most important thing that happened in our culture this week was the decision of the New York State Senate. It already passed the House, and so on January 22nd, the New York State Senate held a vote on, it was called the Reproductive Health Act, and a couple of other related pieces of legislation. I would call it the Gosnell Law. I would name it after Gosnell, the abortion doctor in Philadelphia who murdered perhaps the biggest serial killer in American history. Was recently convicted. You can get the movie, the DVD. It's excellent. It's very well done. It's actually one of the number one rated videos on, or number one selling videos on Amazon. We need to support projects like this. Here's she's sort of the state version, I guess, of Ocasio-Cortez, a young state senator from Kings County. I'm going to play a little bit of what she said. I'm going to play someone who opposed the bill and then the vote in the next video of the legislature voting on January 22nd on the 46th anniversary of the decision of Roe versus Wade. Essentially, what they are voting to do is to remove all restrictions on abortions. And it really goes beyond that. There used to be a provision of New York law that if a child was born alive during an abortion, that efforts would be made to revive it. That section of the law has now been repealed and removed. A lot of pro-life groups are very concerned that children are going to be born alive during these abortion procedures. You can, all the way up to the point, the time of birth, you can abort the child. Some will survive and they'll be left to die, or they'll be given a lethal injection. It's interesting that when Andrew Cuomo came into office, he's very good at using Catholicism when it serves his political purpose. He's a leftist. He's not a Catholic. He's a leftist. But he uses Catholicism like a prop, just like Pope Francis uses his Catholicism as a prop to push his socialist leftist agenda. When the Pope came out and said that we shouldn't have the death penalty, Andrew Cuomo immediately jumped on that and said, yes, we have to stop the death penalty here in the state of New York. And now they're enacting this law that's removing essentially all restrictions on abortions in New York. And I'll explain why after the video. So here you'll hear Senator Salazar. You will hear a Republican senator who opposes. They were allowed to explain their vote on this legislation. And then you'll see the vote and how people reacted to it.
I am proud to be voting to support this legislation today to make sure that we are expanding access to contraception. Thank you.
The reality is this bill today clearly defines, with the move from the criminal statute to a different part of the law, it basically says that we simply do not place any value, legally speaking, on the life of the unborn child, even up to the last minutes of almost up to birth. There is no legal protection or legal value on that child's life, and the reason is because it undercuts the larger argument. And so for those reasons, Madam President, I proudly and regrettably vote no.
Announce the results.
Ayes 38, nays 24.
The bill is passed.
So the bill's not law until it's signed by the governor, and so immediately there was a signing ceremony for Andrew Cuomo to sign the bill. One of the people that was at the signing ceremony was Sarah Weddington. She was the attorney in the Roe versus Wade case that got the Supreme Court to enact essentially a right which has now become in some places like New York an unrestricted right to abortion. Here's just a few comments from the signing ceremony.
It is a good evening this evening. Congratulations, congratulations, congratulations. And we have a special guest of honor. It couldn't come together any better than it's come together today. Sarah Weddington, who argued Roe v. Wade, here today on the 46th anniversary of Roe v. Wade. Let's give Sarah a big round of applause. Just think, when we were debating the Reproductive Health Act, Our Republican colleagues in the Senate said to us it's unnecessary anyway, because no one would ever try to reverse Roe v. Wade. Remember that? That's what they said. It was unnecessary because nobody would try to reverse Roe v. Wade. Well, how wrong they were. Because this president and these extremists are going there. Do not kid yourself. Today's decision on the military ban for transgender, that 5-4, you're going to hear that over and over and over again. That's why they wanted the Supreme Court. And that's why we had to pass this law to protect our state. And that's why I believe we have to go even a step further and do a constitutional amendment so no governor, no legislator, no political swing can ever jeopardize a woman's right to control her own body in this state.
And here he gives an award, a New York State award, to Sarah Weddington, and then he's going to sign the bill.
Congratulations.
I was messaging this morning with Charlie Garrett from Superior Word down in Sarasota, and I think his sentiments tracked my sentiments and those of many other people I talked to or communicated with this week, that this is one of the most disturbing, troubling things that we see now. Look, the reason for this legislation, and since this came out on Tuesday, other states, I think Vermont, other states have announced they're going to remove all abortion restrictions in their states as well. The reason for this is they anticipate that Roe versus Wade could be overturned by the Supreme Court, and they're ahead of the game. They're planning for the future. So if Roe versus Wade is overturned by the Supreme Court, it does not mean that would result in a ban on abortion in the United States. That will never be a decision, that will be never part of a decision that overturns Roe versus Wade. What will happen is the decision will be returned to the states. And so certain states, I've said this in the past, certain states are going to allow abortion. Some are not. Iowa, I think, enacted a heartbeat legislation yesterday that restricted no abortions if a fetal heartbeat is detected. And that's a compromise position. It's a step in the right direction. Ohio's tried to do that, but our outgoing governor decided that it was important for him, as part of his legacy, to veto that legislation. And then some senators who, to say they lack courage is an understatement, decided to switch their vote and would not vote to overturn Kasich's veto. But these states, so what happens is some states will have restrictions on abortions, some will not. The only way to ban abortion in the United States is to get a constitutional amendment that does it. That's the only way that it's ever going to happen. Now, if you look at what the Pew Research polls that I cited earlier say about the political orientation of the upcoming generations, this is very troubling, and I just don't think it's going to happen. Somebody sent me this little cartoon. You mean you don't have a humane society that protects you, a couple of animals, puppy and cat looking at a young baby? So what Cuomo did was that he ordered certain landmarks throughout New York City and elsewhere, I think up in Albany as well, to be bathed in the color pink. So here you see on the left, you see the Mario Cuomo Bridge in New York City, bathed in pink. On the right, you see One World Trade Center, also called the Freedom Tower, bathed in pink. This is a direct, the evil, despicable nature of Andrew Cuomo was demonstrably apparent when he did this week. Because it is interesting, and I think what is lost on a lot of people is that at the base of the One World Trade Center is a memorial to the towers that fell on 9/11. And included in that memorial are the names of the almost 3,000 people that were killed that day. In 11 instances in that memorial, it gives the name of a woman and her unborn child. There were 11 pregnant women who were killed that day. But it was not just them that was killed. It was them and their unborn child. The examples are all over the 9/11 memorial. 11 instances, and you see it here, the phrase, and her unborn child. So the irony is that the governor of New York really shoved it in the face of those of us who are pro-life and have a biblical view of morality. The battle line is drawn. It's very apparent. It's never been more apparent than it was this week. Now, that was not the only thing that the state legislature did. This is a report. This is Good Morning America appears to be doing its best each week to undermine traditional biblical morality. Here's George Stephanopoulos introducing a segment on Kate Hudson. Listen carefully to this.
GMA cover story, Kate Hudson is opening up about how she's trying to raise her new baby as genderless. Apparently that's an approach more and more American families are trying.
So raising a child as genderless is an approach that more and more American families are trying. This is clearly and again, this is accepted. This is mainstream morning happy talk news programs in the morning in America now that discuss these issues without any judgment. And of course, they interviewed Kate Hudson, and she said, "Yeah, we're trying this with our daughter." Now, I don't know why she refers to her as her daughter, but this is a trend. And what's going to happen is they're going to raise confused children. This is child abuse. What they should be doing is taking these children away from these people. But this is trend. This is hip. This is cool. And biblical morality has nothing to do with it. Now, the other legislation was, and this is from the New York Daily News, it's Trantastic. Gender ID bias ban ends a 16-year battle. They put in a law in New York signed by Governor Cuomo that essentially that added transgender to the sex discrimination laws. This week was also Davos, the annual World Economic Forum that takes place in Davos, Switzerland. To be honest with you, it was kind of a dud. They also held the Davos, Switzerland World Economic Forum this week. This is where all the business leaders and political leaders of the world get together. It was interesting this year, though. It was really, last year I think it was pretty significant, but this week I watched some of the sessions. It was really a bit of a dud. It was just a bunch of elites coming together, patting themselves on the back, and going back to their countries and thinking that, well, maybe what's going on in my country maybe look bad, but it's really not that bad because there are people that agree with me. I just spent a week with them in Davos. Here's one little clip of an interview with former Secretary of State of the United States, John Kerry.
If you had President Trump sitting right opposite you, what would your message to him be?
I can't play that. I would. But I know that, you see, because he doesn't take any of this seriously. He doesn't have an ability to have that kind of conversation.
So what would you say to him to get it serious? What would your message be?
Resign.
Okay.
Now, the Wall Street Journal looked at that in the Wall Street Journal editorial page yesterday, or one of the editorials yesterday, talked about, sort of compared the Covington story to what was going on in Davos. Here's just a little bit from that editorial. The Covington story didn't penetrate much into the consciousness of the people gathered this week in Davos, Switzerland, where I spent the last few days at the annual World Economic Forum meeting. The gathering was defined more by notable absences. President Trump fighting a rearguard action to salvage some political capital from the wreckage of the government shutdown. Theresa May desperately trying to construct some kind of habitable Brexit from the charred timbers of her ill-fated deal. Emmanuel Macron figuratively penned up in the Elysee Palace as the yellow vests swarm around him. Goes on and talks about a number of other people who were not there. One of the few world leaders who did come was the newly triumphant and populist Jair Bolsonaro of Brazil, and he rather oddly stayed and spoke for about 7 minutes. The Davos gathering was for a while now the Davos gathering has for a while now had a slight feeling of besieged fortress. So they talked about the fact that it just didn't seem that significant. The mood among those who came this year was uneasy. Gone was the optimism about global synchronized growth from last year. Gone was a glimmer of belief that escalating prosperity might be enough to see off the barbarians at the gate. Above all, China looms on everyone's horizon. And not mainly because of the fears of trade war. Most of the CEOs, Wall Street crowd, and others I spoke to seemed to think a trade deal between Trump and President Xi Jinping was likely. The real fear is manifests in a mounting sense that this is a mere skirmish in a more consequential struggle for the world over the next decade. For many people here, the passing of the years is marked in Davosian time. One participant captured the sense of foreboding well. Last year, Davos felt like 2006. This year feels like 2007. Those years, of course, mark respectively the peak of the frenzied optimism of the last business cycle and the first chilling presentations of what was to come. We all know what 2008 brought. So it's a good editorial, indicates that there's trouble ahead. This is part, I think, of the birth pangs. So let's look at geopolitics briefly, and then we'll finish up here. Interesting meeting this week between Germany and France to sort of renew their vows to a joint defense pact. This is something that they've had in place for quite some time, but they did meet. I think it was very symbolic. It was a doubling down course. Macron has his problems. Merkel is on her way out. And this exactly how this plays into Bible prophecy is it's one of these things I think we just need to kind of wait and see how it plays out. But I can't dismiss that it's a significant thing. Foreign Policy's new magazine this week came out, A Decade of Global Thinkers. It talks about a number of different categories: politics, technology, science. Who are the leaders in that? It talks about the future global thinkers that are going to guide the world in the coming decade. One of whom is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the congresswoman from the Bronx. Actually, she's from suburban Westchester County. Originally, she just lives in the Bronx now. It talks about others, the people that are important. It's interesting. You see here Putin, Kim of Korea, Erdogan of Turkey, Xi Jinping of China, the strongmen. This is foreign policy looking in the near term who's going to be in charge, and they're looking at strong men. I think this is highly significant prophetically. One of the other people that they look at as the person who has the lead in defense and security is Qasem Soleimani, who is the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. He's called Iran's deadly puppet master. And the article written by General Stanley McChrystal explains exactly why Qasem Soleimani is so dangerous. Listen to a little bit about this, because I think we know that Persia, Iran plays a very significant role in the last days, that there are some other things we'll see in a moment that are going on the northern borders of Israel that are pretty significant. It talks about the fact that there was an opportunity that the U.S. had about 2007 to eliminate Soleimani, but they decided not to undergo the operation. But there was a reason that they might want to take out Soleimani when he was in Iraq. There was good reason to eliminate Soleimani, McChrystal says. At the time, Iranian-made roadside bombs built and deployed at his command were claiming the lives of U.S. troops across Iraq. But to avoid a firefight and the contentious politics that would follow, I decided that we should monitor the caravan, not strike immediately. By the time the convoy had reached Erbil, Soleimani had slipped away into the darkness. These days, McChrystal says, he still operates outside the spotlight. Soleimani has grown from a military commander into a ghostly puppet master, relying on quiet cleverness and grit to bolster Iran's international influence. His brilliance, effectiveness, and commitment to his country have been revered by his allies and denounced by his critics in equal measure. What all seem to agree on, however, is that the humble leader's steady hand has helped guide Iranian foreign policy for decades, and there is no denying his successes on the battlefield. Soleimani is arguably the most powerful and unconstrained actor in the Middle East today. U.S. defense officials have reported that Soleimani is running the Syrian civil war via Iran's local proxies, all on his own. The prominence the soft-spoken Soleimani has achieved is especially striking given his origins. Born into poverty in the mountains of eastern Iran, he displayed remarkable tenacity at an early age. And he goes on to talk about it. He says, Soleimani is no longer simply a soldier, he is a calculating and practical strategist. Most ruthlessly and at the cost of all else, he has forged lasting relationships to bolster Iran's position in the region. No other individual has comparable success in aligning and empowering the Shiite allies in the Levant. His staunch defense of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad has effectively halted any progress by the Islamic State and other rebel groups, all but ensuring that Assad remains in power and stays solidly allied to Iran. Perhaps most notably under Soleimani's leadership, the Quds forces has vastly expanded its capabilities. His shrewd pragmatism has transformed the unit into a major influencer in intelligence, financial, and political spheres beyond Iran's borders. I hate to read all of this, but I'll read one more paragraph because I think this is very important. It would be unwise, however, to study Soleimani's success without situating him in a broader geopolitical context. He is a uniquely Iranian leader, a clear product of the country's outlook following the 1979 revolution. His expansive assessment of Iranian interests and rights matches those common among Iranian elites. Iran's resistance towards the United States' involvement in the Middle East is a direct result of U.S. involvement in the Iran-Iraq War, during which Soleimani's worldview developed. Above all else, Soleimani is driven by the fervent nationalism that is the lifeblood of Iran's citizens and leadership. He concludes, despite my initial jealousy of Soleimani's freedom to get things done quickly, I believe such restraint is the strength of the U.S. political system. A zealous and action-oriented mindset, if unchecked, can be used as a force for good, but if harnessed to the wrong interests or values, the consequences can be dire. Soleimani is singularly dangerous. He is also singularly positioned to shape the future of the Middle East. Somebody that really bears watching, and an excellent analysis by General McChrystal. Let's look at a few more things that happened now. About a week ago, there were some strikes on the Damascus, some military targets around Damascus International Air Base. In an unusual response, Israel came out and immediately essentially took credit for what had happened. That led to a meeting of the UN Security Council. Here you see the Syrian ambassador to the UN essentially saying, look, you've attacked our airport, we're going to attack Tel Aviv airport. That led to the deployment of Patriot missile batteries around Tel Aviv, around Ben Gurion Airport. The strikes and the satellite photographs of what you see happening the satellite photographs you see of the results of Israeli airstrikes in Syria are pretty stunning in that they pretty much take out the target and nothing else around it. They're very precise in what they hit. There were reports that there were 20 or so Iranian Revolutionary Guard members that were killed in the strike. Iran then launched a missile over the Mount Hermon ski resort into the Golan area of Israel. That missile was shot down by the anti-missile batteries that Israel has in place up there. So this has resulted in a lot of some different. The situation here is a little bit different than it's been in the past. This article, editorial in the Jerusalem Post the other day, the end of the ambiguity policy, Israel's new strategy in Syria. Israel's come out and been very direct that we're the ones who are doing this, we're the ones who are responding, and we're going to continue to respond. Now, some people in Israel, there's a debate going on. Some people don't think that they should be so bold as to come out and say that. It's created a bit of a tension between Israel and Russia. There's been some sort of soft cooperation there. There's concerns that by being too public, Israel will fracture that relationship because Russia will have to do something else to save face. There's a new article in Foreign Policy that came out this week also that's sort of related to what's going on in Syria and talked about the new Iron Curtain, Russia's missile defense challenges U.S. air power, about the S-400 anti-aircraft system has been deployed. And you can see in the map in the lower left-hand corner the places where they have been deployed, including in northern Syria. These missile batteries have a range of about little under 400 miles. You can see here this, if the missile battery is here near Latakia in northern Syria, the missile range takes in all of Israel all the way down to almost to Eilat at the northern end of the Red Sea. So all of this area would be covered by the S-400. It would limit the U.S. ability to operate with impunity in that particular area. The missile batteries that the S-400 is much more capable of of operating its capacity, its ability to fire numbers of missiles and that sort of thing is much greater than even the American Patriot system. It's a problem. It's a game changer. Now, the interesting part is that Russia has given the S-300, which is an earlier version of the anti-aircraft missile system, to Syria, but that was given after the Russian aircraft was shot down by Syrian air defense a number of months ago. It does not appear that in any of the air attacks by Israel, either by missiles or aircraft, that the S-300 missile system is engaged. There's a lot of speculation as to why that may be. It may be that Israel's jamming it, maybe that they have not adequately trained the people in Syria to operate it. Don't know exactly. The IDF issued this particular map. I thought it was kind of interesting. Where Iran is in Syria, and where Iran belongs is in Iran. There is concerns that Iran is increasing its influence, trying to, at least through its proxies, on the Israeli border in southern Lebanon and the Golan. This is the area of the Ezekiel 38-39 invasion. And again, I'm not saying that invasion is imminent. I'm just saying it bears watching as we watch this go together. There is also a report, there was an article in Foreign Policy that the U.S. is backing off a bit on withdrawing all of its troops, that it wants to maintain a base in Tanf, which is in southern Syria, and is really, if the concern is if the U.S. completely withdraws, there will be nothing to block Iran's corridor of influence from Iran through northern Iraq into Syria. They will have their land bridge completed. Now, whether the U.S. maintains that or not, there are reports, though, that the U.S. is trying to consider a way that they can allow those troops to remain there, even though with the declaration that the Islamic State has been defeated, there might be a legal problem for the U.S. troops remaining there. That's something that bears watching. At the same time that this is going on, these reports coming out, Erdogan of Turkey has come out and say, we're going to create a safe zone in Syria. Now, I've told you that there are these indications that Erdogan does not like the Treaty of Lausanne that limited the extent of Turkey's borders in the days after World War I, that he would like to get rid of that, and he would like to expand his influence down into northern Iraq, and has issued even maps to that extent. So Erdogan, and this is from the Daily Sabah today, Turkey to establish safe zones in northern Syria with or without ally support. This is an official mouthpiece publication of the Turkish government. Don't know exactly how this will play out. This is, of course, this is in northern Syria. It's many, hundreds of miles, a couple hundred miles or more from the Golan border with Israel. But it's still significant in that the players that we see that should be involved, some of the players that we should see involved, are sort of there in Syria trying to exert their influence, particularly Turkey and Iran, or Persia, of course. This article was in the New York Times this morning. Ceasefire in Syrian province at risk as extremist group takes over in Erbil in northern Syria. If you remember when the Syria was taking over southern Syria, where the Syrian civil war really started back in 2011 in Dara, the rebel groups were given the opportunity to, you can continue fighting and we will kill you, or you can get on this bus and we will take you to Erbil up here in northern Syria, 200 or so miles away. So what they did is they transported a lot of people up there. There's been a lot of unrest. Now, supposedly, a rebel group has taken over part of that area, and even though there's been a ceasefire in place, now it appears that Syria and Russia may be moving in there, and there's about 3 million people in that area. Well, there were 3 million. I think 1 million have left. They bust all these people in. There are people who, they don't live there. It's a huge mess. So all of this bears watching. So the takeaway from all of this is that with the U.S. announcement of withdrawal from Syria, the landscape of Syria has changed. But it also appears to me, at least the way I'm looking at it, is that Russia is trying to minimize its involvement in Syria. That has then had the result that now there is more of a direct conflict and confrontation going on between Iran and Israel with regard to Iranian presence in Syria. This is something that could quickly spiral into something else, a war. Could involve other people. It might not even involve Iran. It could involve Iranian proxies in the area around Israel, particularly their proxies in Gaza and their proxies of Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. So again, these are things that I don't know how quickly these things will unfold, but there are a lot of people that are expressing concerns about that. An important report was issued this week by the Institute for National Security Studies of Tel Aviv University called the Strategic Survey for Israel 2018 and 2019. I'll make reference to this more in the future, but I think there are important things that you need to know, because I think it helps put into context some of the things that are going on in Israel right now. One of the things it looks at is what's going to happen in the near term. And so one of the things that one of its assessments is that Israel, in a kind of a unique time in its history, faces the potential of a multi-front war in 2019. Of course, this would have significant prophetic implications. So that's point number one. For example, the report says this: exposure of the tunnels project increases the security challenge whereby Israel must deal with several fronts simultaneously: Syria, Lebanon, and the Gaza Strip. In all three areas, Iran supports the military buildup of Israel's enemies. This increases the risk of escalation to the point of war in the northern arena, although at this stage neither side wants it. Hezbollah, which is aware of the mutual deterrence with Israel, is not focusing on the front with Israel and is still called upon to fight alongside Assad in Syria. It is also busy with political activity in Lebanon. While it does not worry about the ongoing buildup of a range of attack capabilities under the cover of mutual deterrence, it will try to avoid war in the near future because it does not want to risk the loss of its achievements in the Syrian project, the rescue of the Assad regime, and the establishment of its own strongholds in Syrian territory, in which it has invested 7 years of fighting with a loss of 3,000 fighters. It also goes on to talk about the implications of all of this for Israel. It is unlikely that the issues on the agenda in the complex Syrian arena will be resolved over the coming year. The end of fighting, stability, and a political settlement are still not visible on the horizon. However, the nature of the arena may be redefined as the conflict stabilizes and new facts are determined by all the relevant parties, and efforts to launch political, economic, and infrastructure reconstruction in Syria may begin. So this is, it's an interesting thing. The Syria is going to be sort of be the focus and the central pivot point of Israeli defense policy going forward. It goes on to say, the more Iran perseveres in its entrenchment efforts in Syria by building an independent military infrastructure and expanding the array of precision military missiles there, as in Lebanon, the greater the probability of military hostilities between Iran and Israel. Israel cannot hold back and allow Iran and Syria and Hezbollah and Lebanon to achieve a critical mass of precision missiles which will threaten its population centers and strategic sites. At most, Israel's dialogue with Russia can help to distance Iran and its proxies from the Golan Heights front, but this is not expected to lead to their complete withdrawal from Syria. True, Russia will try to reduce friction between Israel and Iran and restrict Israeli action in Syria to the south in order to avoid aerial conflict with Israel. However, if Israel tries to attack Iranian strongholds in the north and west of Syria, it will probably have to deal with an enhanced Syrian air defense system operated with Russian help. It then goes on to talk about some various black swan events that might occur. One of those is an all-out war, the all-out scenario. That's where they're attacked by Hezbollah, Iran, Gaza, and others in a war. Nasrallah this morning was just interviewed on Lebanese television, on his TV station that's associated with him, and said, look, we don't care that they've destroyed our tunnels. We have more tunnels than this. We have precision-guided missiles, and we can cover all of what he calls Palestine. We can cover all of Israel. So he was very arrogant in the way that he talked about this. Some of these other potential black swan events that they've talked about would be some of the other potential black swan events. Now, listen, they define black swan event as something that's not likely to occur, or the probability is very low. But I just want you to look at some of these other supposed black swan events that they talk about and ask yourself if these are really things that are not, that are a little bit higher probability than they're letting on. One of those is the day after Abu Mazen. What happens the day after Abbas dies, if he dies this year? What will happen? How will Hamas and Fatah deal with that? Will there be open conflict in the areas of Judea and Samaria? How will Gaza be handled? This is a significant event, and Abbas is an ill man. He was being treated. Reports of him being treated this week. Another black swan event that could happen is the fall of the Egyptian regime. There is tremendous economic turmoil and problems in Egypt right now, probably approaching the level of what they were when the Muslim Brotherhood takeover took place in the early days of the Arab Spring. So Al-Sisi's government is by no means stable, by no means guaranteed that it will go on. And the question is, what will happen? And there's an interesting aspect to the potential fall of the Egyptian regime. And the report says this: the fall of the regime in Egypt and the creation of a Turkish-Egyptian axis against Israel. So while we all say that everything is okay between Israel and Egypt right now, what happens if the al-Sisi regime falls? And to say that this is totally improbable is to ignore the reality of the facts on the ground and what's actually going on in Egypt. The other, and you can see the next one, is the fall of the regime in Jordan. Jordan is suffering from a severe economic crisis, which in large part due to the flood of refugees that have reached its territory. This has put tremendous pressure on the Jordanian regime. It seems to be surviving, but it's very, I think most analysts would say that it's pretty fragile. Plus, if Abu Mazen, Abbas, goes off, over half of the population of Jordan is Palestinian. Does any conflict that might erupt in what's called the West Bank spill over into Jordan? And what impact would that have on the Jordanian regime? And finally, one of the other black swan events is a cyber attack. So listen, all of this is very volatile. We've seen this week that there's some markers in our culture that are not encouraging in the least, particularly with this unrestricted right to abortion. This is a incredibly important thing. We are inviting the judgment of God on us for this. At the same time, things are very volatile in the Middle East right now. U.S. is withdrawing. Russia is sort of hanging in there, but now we have this much more open conflict, direct conflict between Iran and Israel than has been evident to date. So a very exciting time to be alive. Thanks for watching the Prophecy Update. If you haven't subscribed, click on subscribe, and we'll be back with you again next week. Thank you.